He got that story almost right. The house was 3 blocks away. There were 4 kids setting the kitchen table, and I had put my books up on the, I was going to law school and coaching football at the time. You know, my mind was quite intense then. I'd put my books on a refrigerator, sat behind the kitchen table, looked up. I saw this lady in a house coat. I saw 4 kids. I looked over and I saw this guy in a T-shirt like Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire, with no shoes on and Levi's. And I looked around and I said, what the hell's going on? Where's Nancy? Who's my wife? And nobody said anything. And I looked around and it dawned on me. I said, oh, pardon me. I says, I think I'm in the wrong house. And the lady put her hands on her hips and said, yes, I think you are. So I got up, got my books, walked out past the husband. He never said a word. He had his arm on the fireplace like this, went right back out, went home, and told my wife, I said, you better call him. She says, I'm not calling them. Tell him what happened. I says, I can't call him. I says, what the hell is that guy going to do? He'll probably kill his wife. Because I thought, yeah, I was a pretty good-looking 35-year-old then. Anyway, I don't know. I didn't know he was going to tell that story. I don't know, and I have no idea who told him. But anyway, I was glad to hear that somebody else gave Neil some static, because when Neil called me up and asked me to be the presenter for Mike Irwin, I said, Neil, Mike Irwin. He says, yeah. He says, well, we try to get Paterno. He's busy and stuff. But I said, Neil, Mike Irwin. I says, that's 35 years ago. He says, well, I says, the only thing I remember about Mike Irwin, he had red hair and he had a movie star for a mother. You know, you stop. You try to think back. Now, I've been with a lot more teams than he said. I've been with 7 NFL teams, 2 of them twice, 5 colleges, and I've owned 12 houses, been in 7 different apartments. So I've been around, and it's been a long time since I was in this area. I used to be the Penn State recruiter for this area. In fact, I looked at the program, Jim, wanted to see how I miss you, and Paterno had the area at that time. I didn't take over until '62. So I didn't coach Mike. I coached defense, but I didn't coach Mike. Mike was a back. Anyway, when I first heard about Mike, I got a call from John Hyder. Now, John was Mike's high school football coach, basketball coach, and probably, the main reason that Mike went to Penn State. But I get a call from John, and he says, Rad, you better get over here. Now, I'd recruited Bill Huber a couple of years earlier from the same high school, who started for 3 years for us at Penn State, a great football player. And I said, why? He says, well, I got the best back in the state. I said, well, you do? I says, who is he? Mike Irwin. I said, well, tell me about him. How big is he? Oh, he says about 5'10", 11. I said, what's he weigh? He said, I don't know, about 170 pounds. I said, he played basketball. He says, oh, yeah, he's a starter for me. He says, by the way, he says he can stand there and dunk. I said, John, I'll be right over. So I went over to recruit Mike, and there's a story on page 22 about us almost losing Mike, and which is true. It doesn't quite tell the whole story there, but we recruited Mike, and I, of course, visited at least once a week and whatever you were allowed to do, and there weren't too many rules in those days, and phone calls and everything, and Mike had a connection with Maryland. I think he had a relative, his dad's brother or somebody, grandfather, somebody was down in that area, and he had gone there and visited and liked it, and one day the coach from Maryland shows up, and it's near the time to decide where you're going to school, and John Hyder calls me because he thinks Mike's going to Maryland, and I'm not around, and So he calls Paterno. Paterno and I were both, Paterno was just an assistant then. We were both assistants on the staff, and Rip Engel was the head coach. And so Joe gets in a car, and he jumps over, and he gets there just as they're leaving the gym with the Maryland coach. And he grabs Mike and Mike's buddy and grabs him and says, "Come on, we're going to dinner." And the Maryland coach just stood there, didn't know what happened. Mike didn't know what was going on. He told Hyder to meet him secretly, he'd meet him later. So they go to dinner at this nice place in Altoona. They walk in, and there's the Maryland coach sitting at the place where they went to dinner. But anyway, I think Mike Joe either made Mike commit, or however we did it, however he twisted his arm, and Mike called me either that night or the next day or something. And anyway, so we got Mike Irwin. Now, when Mike was at Penn State, what do I remember about him? Well, he was one of the first guys to start right away. He started right away as a sophomore, and we didn't have too many guys that did that. There are probably only about 3 or 4 that ever did that at Penn State that started right away. And when he was a sophomore, we didn't know what to do with him. Mike was our best back on offense. He was our best back on defense. So we decided to play him on offense, or no, on defense. And the most memorable game, of course, might be the greatest defensive game in Penn State history. Might be. John Ebersol played on a team that, without a doubt, had one of the greatest defenses in the history of college football. But we beat Ohio State 27-0. When the first team walked off the field, they had a total offense, that's running and passing, of a minus 14 yards. They didn't have a first down until the fourth quarter. That was by a penalty. And the defense was only in the game 30-some plays, which meant if Ohio State had the ball 10 times, it was 3 downs and out every time. And that team, by the way, ended up shut out a couple other people. Had one of the greatest defensive teams ever, and although the record was only 6-4, may have been at the end of the season as good a team as Penn State's ever had. Now, after that, we moved Mike to offense, then back to defense, okay, then back to offense. So he had a problem in the fact that we weren't loaded in 65 and 66, especially in 66. And we played him both ways in 1966. But we finally got him off track, or on track, when we put him on offense. You know, he averaged over 5 yards a carry. He scored a touchdown one every time, 10 times he carried the ball. But we just didn't give him the ball enough, I guess, on offense. But if he would have played in the days of one platoon football, of course, I think he'd have been a first-string All-American. But anyway, he played a pivotal role in Joe Paterno's career. You know, Joe Paterno's a very successful coach right now, but at that time he was struggling. We ended up that first season 5-5. In the middle of that season, the athletic director up in the box turns to me, he comes in the press box, I work the press box, and says, if we don't get rid of that I formation, we're going to get a new head coach. This is 1965. So I talked it over with George Welsh, my assistant. I said, what do you do? He said, you better tell Joe. I said, okay, I told Joe. So I told Joe. Joe goes in, chews out the athletic director, who was Ernie McCoy. He comes back and he says, you know, Rad, he says, he was right, but I don't want him to know that. He says, we're going to stay in the I formation one more week. He says, then we're getting out of it. So we stayed in the I formation one more week. Then we put Mike Irwin on offense. We went back to our wing T. We beat West Virginia by 40-some points and probably saved Paterno's job. Anyway, I got another little thing. I got here a little early. I got here at 1 o'clock. And I brought Bob Kane with me, who was the middle linebacker in that 64 game I told you about, and played 2 years with Mike, 64-5, is the first-string linebacker for Penn State. And we decided to go up Penn State. We thought they'd be practicing, but they weren't. They'd practiced in the mornings. So we went over to see Bob Phillips, who was one of Mike's coaches his last year. And Bob has Parkinson's disease. And he was in there. We went to the nursing home, and he's sitting there, and I says, hey, he said, what are you doing here? And I said, you know, Bob, I'm going to be the presenter for Mike Irwin. He said, oh, yeah. He says, the redhead. He says, he was a good player. He says, but he used to throw up before every game. So Mike was, I think, a little nervous. But one of the good aspects of that is, I told you about that West Virginia game when we moved them. It was a pivotal game in Paterno's career. Is we had a back called Bob Campbell, who was an outstanding sophomore, but didn't hustle too much. And when we got Mike on offense, we called Campbell in and we said, Bobby, we said, this is the guy that we want you to imitate. We want you to practice like Mike. Okay? And Campbell got the message, and he went on. He's the guy that won the Gator or the Orange Bowl in for us to go undefeated in 1968 on the last play of the game. Anyway, I would like now to present Mike Irwin as your Hall of Famer.